Today we're at Delville Wood, a place that saw some ferocious fighting during the Battle of the Somme, and it's also the place where the South Africans went into combat for the first time during the Battle of the Somme here. Now, before we get started, it's worth noting that the South African involvement in the Great War was not without controversy. It was less than 15 years earlier that the British Empire had been in war during the Second Boer War against the Boer Republic. Now, only 15 years later, people from those same communities are being asked to fight as part of the British Commonwealth Army in the Great War. But nonetheless, they showed up, and they showed up in force. And on the 14th of July, they would go into the front lines here at Delville Wood. By the 14th of July, the British Army had pushed up here to the edge of Delville Wood. By this stage, we're some 2 weeks after the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And this is where the 1st South African Brigade were going to go into action. They would be tasked with pushing beyond the existing British front line and capturing Delville Wood. Now, they would enter the woods at the point where the British front line met the edge of those woods, and that was down in the southwest corner of Delville Wood. And they actually have a marker that marks the point of entry where the South Africans went into those woods for the first time. Okay, so I've just come up to the marker that I mentioned, and right here you can see we are on the edge of the woods, moving kind of north, sort of east from where the British front line was. The South African troops moved forwards here into Delville Wood. So the British had got up to kind of the edge of the woods here by the 14th of July, and as this marker tells us, at 7 AM on the 15th of July, the South Africans moved into Delville Wood, right here at this location where I'm stood now. Here we go. Here's the marker, and you can see advancing in a northeasterly direction at 7 AM on the 15th of July 1916. The attacking force of the South African Infantry Brigade entered Delville Wood at this point. So this is where the guys came through here along the edge of the wood and headed in to Delville Wood. Okay, so the first thing that has struck me straight away, I'm just walking further into the woods from that entry point there, and the ground here is just taken to bits. I'm walking up and down shell holes and holes in this ground. The ground here has just been absolutely destroyed, and my goodness, it gives you an idea of what the guys were dealing with when they were here in these woods. Now, just like the marker where we were, where the South Africans entered the wood, they have these markers all through the woods now to represent what are called rides, and that is basically the kind of open lines that run between the trees through these woods. So, for example, we've got one here that is marked Rotten Row, and Buchanan Street, that went Rotten Row this way and Buchanan Street this way, to kind of give some sort of reference of where you are. Now, the rides were named by the South Africans and the British soldiers who came in here, and a lot of them are named after streets in London. So there is a Princes Street, there's the Strand, and various other ones here through Delville Wood. Under the command of Brigadier General Henry Lukin, 3 battalions of the 1st South African Brigade entered the woods right here and moved their way forwards. Now, they initially actually managed to capture the woods relatively easily. There was some resistance, but not a huge amount, and they managed to push through and started advancing out towards the far edge of the woods here. By the afternoon, the South Africans had captured the woods, but unfortunately the Germans knew the importance of holding this place and capturing this place, and so they launched ferocious counterattacks back through these woods again and again, as well as heavily bombarding this entire area with artillery. Now the problem is, you can see behind me, and in fact everywhere here, apart from these rides that are out in front of us, everywhere in the wooded area is thick and dense undergrowth. And the problem was that made it really difficult for the guys to dig in here. They couldn't dig foxholes or trenches. There were so many tree roots and everything getting in their way. It really stopped them from digging in properly. As well as that, as artillery came in here, trees were exploding, and there were shrapnel wounds coming from bits of tree that were being fired in every direction. You can imagine the hellish place that this would have been under those circumstances. Now, Brigadier General Lukin had been given express strict orders that he was to hold this ground at all costs. So the Germans were bombing this place with artillery and then sending counterattacks into these woods. You can't see very far. In some sections you can barely see 10-20 foot in front of you, even today. And so you can imagine how dense this was. There was sometimes very close-up combat, dense hand-to-hand fighting in and around these trees. And when that wasn't happening, the guys here were getting bombed with artillery. So you can really start to get a feel of the place that this was. And actually, as I've just walked up here as I'm talking, you can see off behind me here, the ground is just absolutely peppered with shell holes and evidence of the bombardments that took place here. So as you get into kind of we're not near the middle of the woods, but kind of sort of the in from the edge around this point here is where Henry Lukin would have held his headquarters. It says on the plaque here, here in a shallow trench at the battle headquarters of the South African infantry during the fighting of Delville Wood. So as a reference point, kind of back over there is where the South Africans entered these woods. You can see the ground here is just torn up. So don't get any impression that Brigadier General Lukin was sort of hidden back away from the fighting, because the amount of shell holes and the damage on this ground right near where his headquarters was tells you that he was certainly right in the thick of the fighting going on here. So we just come up to another one of these markers here. This one marks Princes Street, which runs down pretty much all the way through Delville Wood here ahead of us. This line runs through, not quite at the midpoint, a little bit south of the midpoint, but we're getting out into kind of the middle of the woods here now. Now, the problem was, as well as the counterattacks and the artillery fire the guys were suffering from here, once they'd pushed out and taken the perimeter of the woods here, the South Africans were still near enough surrounded. The Germans held the ground on three sides of these woods, pretty much, and it created like a salient that went around, a salient being a bulge in the line, that went around the perimeter of these woods. So those counterattacks that were coming into the woods were coming from all different directions. And that, combined with the fact that the woods here are so dense and so thick, meant the guys were getting lost and confused. Units were getting separated. At some point they didn't know, was it friendly troops or enemy troops to the right or the left, and that created such confusion here that it was really kind of every direction hand-to-hand fighting. In some sections along the Western Front, you have a very clear British line and then enemy line, and it was not like that here. This was fighting coming from all different angles, ferocious fighting. And when you see the density of it all, you can start to see what I mean when I say it was hand to hand, up close. You can barely see 20 foot into these woods right here. This is a good spot to really get an idea of what I'm saying about the density of these woods. Now, of course, a lot of these trees are new. They wouldn't have been here at the time. There would have been trees here though. This was a very dense wood at the time, but of course a lot of the trees that were here back then have been destroyed or blown to bits by artillery. But you can see the density of the woods. Well, look, and on that note, I mentioned about trees. There's one tree I want to show you. So I talked about trees, and I mentioned that there were trees here at the time, just different trees from the ones that are here. Well, all but one of them. Right here in the middle of the woods, there is this tree, and it is called the last tree, because this is believed to be the only tree that remains from the battles here during the Battle of the Somme. Most of the rest of them, being destroyed with the amount of artillery that was coming here into the woods, but this one tree remains. One of few things that survived these woods unscathed, and I'm sure it was not like it is today. I'm sure it was destroyed heavily, but it lived and it grew again, and it's now a huge flourishing tree. It's amazing to see a piece of history right here that would have been here and seen all of that action around it. Wow. So as we get out here into the middle of the woods, now we kind of start to get a feeling. As I mentioned, the woods were still surrounded on most sides by the Germans. And the problem was the different units here didn't know, when someone else got pushed back, they then didn't know with those guys to the right of them the enemy or friendly troops. And you had different pockets of fighting, and it just turned into an absolute melee in these woods. And that contributed to a lot of the casualties here because, it couldn't be structured or organized in ways like it normally would in this type of combat, and the thickness of the woods and the trees here just made it horrendous for them as they tried to work out what was going on. Who's that up ahead, who's that to my left, who is behind me even. It really was a thankless task here. After 6 days of brutal fighting here, the South Africans were eventually removed from these sections of the woods and taken off the front line. The South Africans had entered the woods here at Delville Wood on the 15th of July with a strength of 121 officers, 3,032 other ranked men. At their roll call on the 21st of July, they numbered 29 officers and 751 other ranks. Now in the middle of Delville Wood here, they have the South African monument here to commemorate all the South Africans who've lost their lives. They also have a really cool museum, which is kind of through here behind me. I haven't filmed in there, but if ever you come here, I really recommend checking that out because they've got some really cool stuff in there that's well worth checking out as well. So outside the front of the kind of museum, so it's in between the museum and the memorial here, they have a wall which has got all the names of those who lost their lives. Now it's worth noting that these names on these two walls are actually all those men who've been killed, as opposed to like a wall of the missing like you often get in these kind of memorials. The South African missing men are actually named in and amongst the memorials with the British soldiers rather than being separate like the Canadian memorials and so on. The South Africans are named on places like Delville and along the other memorials with the British. But here, so both sides of this, all the way down, the memorials just here behind me. Names of, thousands of names. Wow. Following the Great War in 1920, this whole piece of land was purchased by the South Africans and kept and preserved as a memorial to those, with this being a place of such sacrifice for the South Africans. This was the place preserved to act in that way, and that's why when you walk around here it is so well kept. And an area on the battlefields here at the Western Front, I guess a little bit like the Newfoundland Memorial Park, where it really is one of the best preserved areas, and where you can still see shell holes and some kind of shallow trench remains that really do kind of show you what went on here. And this is one of the places, probably more so than most, where you can really feel like, oh my goodness, such thick undergrowth, and not knowing who was around you, it would have been a horrible place to be. But I'm thankful that it's been preserved in this way so that we can come and see it today. So just out the front of Delville Wood here, you can see, this is the wood behind me, and you can see the museum and the monument I talked about. Just across the road here, you have the cemetery where a lot of the men who were killed here are buried. Now, I should say that a huge proportion of the South Africans who were killed in Delville Wood do not have a known grave, and maybe given the circumstances in there, it's perhaps sadly not surprising. So this cemetery has graves from all over. I'm actually Chris from Blogging Through History is here as well, and he was just saying he's had a walk around here and he can see people from all over the British Commonwealth in this cemetery. I believe this is the third largest Commonwealth grave cemetery here on the Somme. So if you do ever come to the Somme, I highly recommend visiting the cemetery here at Delville Wood. A little side story to Delville Wood, but perhaps helps kind of explain the way it was seen by the guys who were here. A few different places along the Somme were called different names. You know, like Mouquet Farm is Mucky Farm, and Ocean Villas is Ocean Villas and stuff like that. But Delville Wood was called Devil's Wood by the guys who fought here. And whilst I guess that's kind of an obvious play on names, Delville, Devil, but I guess perhaps it speaks to what the guys thought about what it was like to be in the lines in these woods and to fight in these woods. Devil Wood. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I've got to say, I've been to the Somme a few times now, and this is the first time I'd visited Delville Wood. And yeah, having been here, it is probably one of my favourite places along the Somme. So if you do come here, I highly recommend visiting Delville Wood. Check it out, there's lots to see, really worth having a look around there. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. See you on the next one.